The morning light poured through the tall windows of the courthouse, cutting across the polished wooden benches. It was a quiet Monday, the kind that made the air feel still before the crowd arrived. The janitor had just finished sweeping the floor, and the faint smell of lemon cleaner hung in the room. Soon, the hum of footsteps and the low whispers of people waiting for their cases began to fill the space. Judge William Carter walked into the courtroom right on time, as he always did. He was a man of routine. Every day he arrived at 8:30 sharp, reviewed his case files, and entered the courtroom with the same calm expression. He had been a judge for more than 20 years, and few things surprised him anymore. He believed in rules, in order, in evidence. Emotions had no place in his courtroom, he often told himself. This case, on the schedule for that morning, didn't seem different from the rest. A young man named Daniel Morris was accused of theft, stealing food and some medicine from a local convenience store. Nothing big, just another small crime that would probably end in a fine or a few months in jail. But there was something in the young man's file that made Judge Carter pause for a moment before the hearing started. Daniel was only 22 with no serious criminal record. There was a note from the public defender saying he had been struggling to care for his sick mother. Still, the judge closed the file and sighed. He'd seen plenty of people with excuses before. The bailiff called the court to order. All rise. Everyone stood as Judge Carter entered, his black robe flowing slightly as he walked to his seat. He nodded once and everyone sat down. The gavel hit the wooden block with a sharp sound that echoed through the room. "The court is now in session," he said, his voice steady and firm. "Case number 1342, the state versus Daniel Morris." Daniel stood next to his lawyer, a thin man in a worn-out suit who looked like he hadn't slept much. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he held them together. He looked pale, his eyes tired and his clothes a little too big for his small frame. The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with a sharp voice, began to speak. "Your Honor, this is a simple case. The defendant, Daniel Morris, was caught stealing food, milk, and over-the-counter medicine from a local store last week. Security cameras captured the act clearly. The store owner called the police immediately. We're seeking a standard sentence for theft under local law." She sat down with a satisfied look, her papers neatly stacked. Judge Carter turned his attention to the defense. "Mr. Daniels," he said to the lawyer, "you may present your side." The defense lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client does not deny that he took the items. However, the reasons behind his actions deserve to be heard. He wasn't stealing for money or greed. He was trying to help his sick mother who—" The prosecutor interrupted. "Objection, Your Honor. The facts are clear. The law doesn't change because of sympathy." Judge Carter raised a hand. "Overruled. Continue, Mr. Daniels. Let the defendant speak for himself." Daniel swallowed hard. His lawyer gave him a small nod. Slowly, Daniel stepped forward, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him standing. "Your Honor," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "I know what I did was wrong. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I didn't know what else to do." He took a deep breath, his eyes flicking toward the ground. "My mom's been sick for a long time. She can't work. She used to clean houses, but her health got worse last year. I lost my job at the factory 2 months ago and we ran out of money. We couldn't afford her medicine anymore. The doctor said she needed it or she'd get worse." The courtroom was silent except for his trembling voice. "I tried to get help. I went to 3 places asking for work. Nobody would hire me without a degree or experience. I even went to the community center, but they said the waiting list for help was long. I didn't know what to do, Your Honor. When I saw the shelves at that store, I just thought maybe I could grab a few things and get away with it. I wasn't proud of it." Judge Carter watched the young man closely. He noticed how Daniel's eyes weren't defiant or angry. They were tired. The kind of tiredness that comes from trying too hard for too long. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably but stayed quiet. Daniel's lawyer stepped in again. "Your Honor, my client returned most of the items when he was caught. He didn't resist arrest. He was cooperative and honest with the police. This isn't the case of a habitual thief. This is a case of survival." Judge Carter leaned back in his chair. His fingers tapped lightly on the table as he thought. He looked at Daniel, then at the file again. There was a brief note written by the arresting officer. Suspect was polite. Requested that we check on his mother after his arrest. That line stayed with him for a moment. The judge adjusted his glasses. Mr. Morris, you say your mother is ill. What kind of illness does she have? Daniel hesitated. She has a heart condition, sir. She can't move much without getting dizzy or losing her breath. I've been trying to take care of her since my dad left. We don't have family nearby. The medicine helps keep her stable. Judge Carter nodded slowly, though his expression didn't change. And you had no one else to help? No, sir, Daniel said softly. I tried everywhere I could think of. The judge turned his gaze down to his notes, but for a moment his thoughts drifted away. He remembered his own younger days, when his wife had fallen ill. How helpless he had felt watching her fade while the bills kept piling up. He had been lucky then. He had friends, savings, and a community to help him. This boy, standing in front of him, had none of that. But the law was the law, and he had taken an oath to follow it. The prosecutor spoke again, breaking the silence. Your Honor, we sympathize, but sympathy doesn't excuse crime. If every person who faced hardship broke the law, society would collapse. We ask for the minimum jail sentence to set an example. Daniel lowered his head. His lawyer looked at him, whispering something that sounded like reassurance, though the words were too soft to hear. Judge Carter rubbed his chin. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down. He knew the right thing legally was to issue a sentence, but something in him hesitated. He looked again at Daniel, at his shaking hands, at the way his voice had cracked when he talked about his mother. There was no arrogance in him, no deceit. Just a quiet kind of desperation that most people never noticed until they'd lived through it themselves. For a long time, the judge said nothing. He flipped through the case file again, reading lines he already knew by heart. Each word felt heavier now. He finally spoke, his voice softer than before. The court will take a short recess. We'll resume in 15 minutes. The gavel struck again. The sound echoed through the silent room. As the judge stood and walked toward his chambers, he couldn't help but glance one more time at the young man sitting quietly by himself. There was something about him that stirred an old memory, something he couldn't quite place yet. Behind him, Daniel closed his eyes and whispered a small prayer under his breath. Not for himself, but for his mother waiting at home. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the tension stayed in the air. Even the prosecutor seemed quieter, her usual confidence dimmed by what she had just heard. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, lighting up the courthouse steps. But inside Judge Carter's mind, clouds were gathering. Memories, doubts and questions that he hadn't faced in years. He didn't know yet that this ordinary-looking case would soon uncover a truth so powerful that it would leave him speechless. The short recess gave everyone a chance to breathe, but the air in the courtroom still felt heavy when the session resumed. Daniel sat quietly beside his lawyer, staring down at his hands. His heart was racing even though he tried to stay calm. He wasn't afraid of jail as much as he was afraid of what would happen to his mother if he couldn't get back home to her. When the bailiff called the court back to order, Judge Carter walked in slower than before. His usual firm steps were replaced by something more thoughtful, almost hesitant. He took his seat and adjusted his robe, but his eyes lingered on Daniel a little longer this time. Mr. Morris, he began, I've listened to what you said earlier. The court understands that your situation is difficult. However, stealing is still a crime under the law. Before I make any decision, I need to fully understand the circumstances. Daniel nodded. His voice came out soft. Yes, Your Honor. The judge leaned back slightly. You mentioned your mother is ill. Where is she now? At home, sir, Daniel replied. She can't walk far anymore. The neighbors check on her sometimes when I have to go out. The prosecutor, sitting with her pen ready, spoke up. Your Honor, I'd like to remind the court that personal hardship, while unfortunate, does not change the legal definition of theft. Judge Carter glanced at her, not unkindly, but firmly. Duly noted. However, the court will hear the full story before judgment. Daniel's lawyer stood and asked if his client could share more about his mother's condition. The judge nodded. Daniel hesitated, then spoke again. She was diagnosed with a heart condition 2 years ago. She used to work as a housekeeper, but she had to stop. She started feeling dizzy all the time. The doctor said she needed medication and a special diet, but everything costs more than we have. I tried to keep up. I took extra shifts at the factory, but when it closed, we had nothing left. His voice trembled. We sold most of what we had. I even sold my old bike. I didn't want to ask anyone for money. I just thought I could figure it out. But when she got worse, I panicked. I went to the store that night thinking I could grab what she needed, just enough to last a few days. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't see another way. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Even the people sitting on the benches behind him, strangers who had come to watch other hearings, looked uneasy. The judge's expression softened slightly. "Did you ever try to apply for assistance programs?" Daniel nodded. "I did, sir. But they said I needed documents and proofs I didn't have. It takes weeks. I didn't have weeks. My mom was struggling to breathe." For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of papers turning and chairs creaking was the only thing that broke the silence. Judge Carter turned to the prosecutor. "Does the store owner wish to make a statement?" The prosecutor checked her folder. "Yes, Your Honor, Mr. Harris is present." A man in his 50s stood up from the back row. He looked like he had been in business for years, the kind of man who had seen every type of customer walk through his doors. His eyes met Daniel's for a second before he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, "I don't want to press for a harsh sentence. When I saw the security footage, I was angry at first. But when the police brought him back and I saw his face, I realized he wasn't a troublemaker. He looked scared. He even said he was sorry before I said a word. He told me he just needed food and medicine for his mom. I didn't believe it right away, but later one of my employees told me they'd seen him buying the same things before. When he had money." The store owner paused, taking a slow breath. "I still filed the report because stealing is stealing. But if it's true what he's saying, I don't want to see him punished too hard. I've got kids myself. I know what it's like trying to keep your family safe." The judge gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. You may sit." Daniel looked at him, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to thank him but didn't know how to speak. Judge Carter turned back to Daniel. "You said your mother is alone now?" "Yes, sir." "Would she be able to come here if the court requested her presence?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't think so. She can't walk far, and she doesn't have transportation." The judge sat silently for a moment, then said, "The court can arrange for her to be brought here tomorrow if necessary." The prosecutor frowned. "Your Honor, is that really required?" "The facts of the theft are clear." But the judge didn't look at her. His mind was already somewhere else. There was something about this woman, this mother Daniel spoke about, that tugged at a faint memory. A face he couldn't quite recall, but one that felt strangely familiar. He made a note on his paper and looked up again. "We'll adjourn until tomorrow morning. I'd like to hear from the defendant's mother before making any ruling." The gavel struck once more. The courtroom began to empty, but Judge Carter didn't rise immediately. He watched Daniel being escorted out by the bailiff. The boy turned once at the door, just long enough for the judge to see the tiredness in his face again. That night, the courthouse lights went off one by one, but the image of that young man stayed with the judge long after he left the building. When he got home, his house was quiet, too quiet. His wife had passed years ago, and he had grown used to the silence. Still, he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd heard. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the papers he'd brought home. He flipped through Daniel's file again. There were hospital notes, letters from a doctor recommending financial assistance, and a handwritten message from Daniel himself. A plea for help he'd once sent to the city's social office but never got a reply. The judge sighed. He had seen so many cases where the system failed before it even began. People falling through cracks not because they were criminals but because life had closed every other door on them. He rubbed his temples and leaned back in his chair. "You're getting soft, Bill," he muttered to himself, using his first name in a rare moment of reflection. The law is the law. But a small voice inside him whispered, "Yes, but justice is more than that." He couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Why did the boy's story feel so close to home? Why did his mother's situation stir something deep in his memory? The next morning, when he arrived at court, the bailiff informed him that Daniel's mother had agreed to come, with help from a volunteer nurse. When the door opened and the woman entered, the entire courtroom went quiet. She was thin and pale, her steps slow and unsteady. She held onto the nurse's arm for balance, her eyes scanning the room. When she looked up at the judge, her face softened. And in that instant, Judge Carter froze. He knew her. He couldn't remember her name yet, but he remembered her face, the same calm and kind expression from years ago. She had been there during one of the hardest times of his life. The hospital room, the late nights, the quiet words of comfort she had once given his dying wife. His throat tightened. For the first time in many years, he didn't know what to say. Daniel turned around as his mother reached him, helping her to the chair beside him. She smiled faintly at her son, then looked up at the judge again, the man she didn't seem to recognize yet. Judge Carter gripped the edge of his desk. The courtroom faded into silence. He knew that whatever this case was about, it was no longer just another file in his pile of daily work. This was something far more personal. The room stayed still for a moment, as if time itself had stopped. Everyone in the courtroom looked at the woman sitting beside Daniel, but all eyes soon turned to the judge. Judge Carter's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. His heart was beating faster than it had in years. He couldn't stop staring at the woman in front of him, her tired face, her gentle smile, the way she spoke softly to her son. It was her. Memories began to rise in his mind like waves he couldn't hold back. He saw himself years ago, sitting in a hospital room next to his wife, who had been slowly slipping away after a long illness. He remembered the endless nights, the sound of the heart monitor, the heavy smell of medicine and disinfectant. And through all of that pain there had been one nurse, quiet, patient, and kind, and who had never lost her calm. She had comforted his wife, talked to her gently even when she was too weak to answer. That nurse had been the same woman. He hadn't seen her in over a decade, but her face hadn't changed in the ways that mattered. The kindness was still there. "Your Honor," Daniel's lawyer said carefully, breaking the silence, "and this is Mrs. Morris, the defendant's mother." The judge nodded slowly, though his throat felt tight. "Thank you. Please, Mrs. Morris, take your time." The nurse helped her sit down. She smiled politely at the judge, not realizing yet who he was. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. Her voice had that same warmth that had once brought comfort to his wife's hospital room. The judge cleared his throat and looked down at his notes to regain control of himself. He needed to stay professional. "Mrs. Morris, we're here to discuss the case involving your son. He's accused of theft, and we're trying to understand what led to it. Please tell the court what happened in your own words." She nodded and took a deep breath. Her hands were trembling slightly. "Your Honor, my son has always been a good boy. He never caused trouble, not once. When I got sick, he was the only one who stayed with me. His father left when Daniel was little. It's just been the two of us ever since. He worked hard at the factory, did everything he could to make sure we had food and rent." She paused, swallowing hard. "But when the factory shut down, things got bad. I tried to tell him not to worry, that we'd manage somehow, but I knew he hadn't eaten properly for days just so I could have my medicine. I told him not to do anything foolish. I never wanted him to steal. He only wanted to help me." The courtroom was silent again. Even the prosecutor didn't move. "I didn't even know what he'd done until the police came that night," she continued. "When they told me he'd been arrested, I thought my heart would stop. I told the officer it was my fault, not his. If I weren't sick, none of this would have happened. He's a good boy, Your Honor, please. Please don't take him away from me." Her voice broke and she reached for her son's hand. Daniel turned to her, trying not to cry, but his lips trembled. The judge sat back in his chair. He couldn't speak. His chest felt heavy, not just from pity, but from something deeper, a painful mix of memory and realization. This woman had once stood beside him during the worst moment of his life, offering strength when he had none left. And now she was standing before him, fragile and desperate, needing mercy for her son. He wanted to say something, but for a few seconds, no words came out. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morris," he said gently, "do you remember working at St. Luke's Hospital about 12 years ago?" She blinked in surprise. "Yes, Your Honor, I worked there for almost 15 years. The judge nodded slowly. "I thought so. You might not remember, but you took care of my wife during her last few months." The courtroom stirred with whispers. Daniel looked at the judge in shock, not understanding what he meant. Mrs. Morris stared at him, searching his face. Then her eyes widened as recognition washed over her. "Oh my goodness," she said softly. You're Mr. Carter. Your wife was Anna." The judge gave a small, sad smile. "Yes, you stayed with her when I couldn't. You comforted her when I was too broken to speak. I never forgot that." Tears filled the woman's eyes. "I didn't know you became a judge." I'm so sorry for your loss, sir. She was such a sweet lady. He nodded again, swallowing the lump in his throat. You were her favorite nurse. You gave her peace when the rest of the world couldn't. I owe you more than I can ever say. The courtroom fell completely silent. Everyone could feel the emotion in the air, heavy, real, and human. For a moment, no one was a judge or a defendant or a lawyer. They were just people, sharing a memory of pain and kindness. The judge took a deep breath and composed himself. Mrs. Morris, he said softly, you've done so much good in your life, and now I see that goodness in your son. Please rest assured that this court will handle this matter with fairness and compassion. He paused, looking at Daniel. Mr. Morris, you may sit with your mother for now. Daniel helped her back into her chair. The nurse beside them smiled kindly. The prosecutor stood up, clearly unsure what to say next. Your Honor, I understand this situation is emotional, but the law still— The judge lifted his hand slightly. I know what the law says, counselor, but the law also allows for understanding, for discretion, when the circumstances show true need. The prosecutor nodded and sat back down. There was nothing more to argue. The judge leaned forward, his voice lower, more personal now. When I lost my wife, Mrs. Morris, you told me something I've never forgotten. You said, sometimes all we can do for people is be kind. The world has enough pain already. Do you remember that? She smiled faintly. I do. Well, he said, his voice softening, it seems your words have come back to me today. The courtroom stayed quiet as the judge sat in thought. His eyes were wet, but he didn't hide it. He knew he couldn't let emotion blind justice, but he also knew that real justice wasn't just about rules. It was about the story behind them, the truth of why people make the choices they do. After a long silence, he finally spoke. The court will take the remainder of the day to review this case and decide the most appropriate course of action. I thank you, Mrs. Morris, for your testimony. The gavel struck gently, and the session was adjourned. As everyone began to leave, the judge stayed seated, staring at the empty bench in front of him. His heart felt heavier than it had in years. When the courtroom finally cleared, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The bailiff approached quietly. Sir, are you all right? The judge nodded slowly. Yes, I'm fine, just thinking. He looked toward the door where Daniel and his mother had exited. Sometimes, he murmured to himself, justice comes back to find you, in ways you never expect. He sat there for a long time after everyone had gone, remembering his wife's smile, the soft words of the nurse who had cared for her, and the broken young man who had risked everything for love. He knew that tomorrow would be one of the hardest days of his career, not because of the law, but because of what it meant to his heart. That night, Judge Carter couldn't sleep. He kept turning in bed, his mind replaying every word from the courtroom. The memory of Mrs. Morris's tired face and Daniel's trembling hands stayed with him like a shadow. He had handled hundreds of cases over his career, but this one was different. This wasn't just about law anymore. It was about life, about debt, about kindness that had once been given and was now returning in a way he never expected. When he finally got up, the house was still and quiet. He made himself a cup of coffee, but it went cold before he could drink it. He sat at the kitchen table staring at an old photograph of his wife, Anna. She was smiling, her eyes soft and warm. For a moment he could almost hear her voice again, calm and gentle, the way it always was when life felt too heavy. She used to say, "Do what's right, not just what's written." Those words echoed in his head until the sun came up. By the time he arrived at the courthouse the next morning, his decision was still uncertain. He didn't know what judgment he would give yet, but he knew he couldn't ignore what his heart was telling him. Inside the courtroom, the air was quieter than usual. The people sitting on the benches spoke in low whispers, waiting. Daniel sat beside his lawyer again, his mother in her wheelchair beside him. She looked weaker than the day before, but she still managed to smile when her son reached over to hold her hand. The judge entered, and everyone stood. His robe looked heavier today, like it carried the weight of something more than authority. He nodded, and the room sat down. "The court will now resume the case of the state versus Daniel Morris," he said softly. His voice didn't have the same sharpness it usually did. It was calm, but full of feeling. The prosecutor stood and spoke first. "Your Honor, while we understand the emotional side of this case, the law requires that theft be punished accordingly. However, given the testimony of both the defendant and his mother, the state will not oppose a reduced sentence if Your Honor deems it appropriate." The judge gave a slow nod. It was unusual for a prosecutor to show leniency. Even she, it seemed, had been moved by what she'd seen. He turned his gaze to Daniel. "Mr. Morris, do you wish to say anything before I deliver my judgment?" Daniel stood. His voice was small but steady. "I just want to say I'm sorry. I know I broke the law. I didn't want to. I only wanted to help my mom. I know that doesn't make it right, but I'll do anything to make it up. I'll work, I'll volunteer, I'll pay the store back for what I took. I just want to go home to my mom and take care of her." His mother wiped her eyes, smiling weakly through her tears. The judge looked down for a moment, then up again. His voice was soft when he began to speak. "Mr. Morris," he said, "I've sat in this chair for over 20 years. I've heard stories of greed, anger, and cruelty. But your story is not one of those. Yours is a story of love. Desperate, flawed, but love all the same." He paused, his eyes meeting Daniel's. "Still, the law cannot be ignored. You committed a crime. But sometimes, justice is not only about punishment. It's also about understanding the heart behind the act." Daniel's lawyer lowered his head, quietly relieved. The judge turned slightly to Mrs. Morris. "You once showed my wife kindness when no one else could. You stayed late at the hospital unpaid just to make sure she wasn't alone. I remember you bringing her tea and singing to her softly when she couldn't sleep. You gave her peace. And today I see that same kindness in your son's eyes." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. He continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I cannot forget what you did for my family, and I cannot let the law forget that mercy, too, is part of justice." He took a deep breath. "Therefore, I will not be sending your son to jail. Instead, I'm ordering a suspended sentence and community service. Mr. Morris will assist at the community center and help distribute food and medicine to families in need. This way, he will repay society not with punishment but with compassion, the same compassion that once saved me." Gasps filled the courtroom. Daniel covered his face with his hands, overcome with relief. His mother sobbed quietly beside him, whispering prayers of gratitude. The prosecutor nodded respectfully. Even she couldn't argue with the decision, but the judge wasn't done. He looked directly at Daniel. "Young man, I'm giving you a second chance. Don't waste it. The same strength that made you fight for your mother, use it to help others. You have more power to do good than you realize." Daniel nodded quickly, his voice shaking. "I will, sir. I promise." "Thank you." The judge gave a faint smile. "You can thank your mother. She's the reason you're walking out of here today." The gavel struck the block, but it sounded softer than usual. Not like an order, but like the closing of a gentle chapter. The courtroom filled with quiet whispers. People were smiling, some even wiping away tears. In all his years on the bench, Judge Carter had never seen such a reaction. As Daniel wheeled his mother toward the exit, he stopped and looked back. Their eyes met for a brief moment. No words were spoken, but the message was clear: gratitude, respect, and something deeper that words could never capture. When they left, the courtroom felt strangely lighter. The judge sat alone at his bench for a long time after everyone had gone. His hands rested on the table, still and calm. He felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He looked toward the window, where sunlight spilled across the floor, and whispered to himself, "Anna, I hope you'd be proud." It was the first time he'd spoken his wife's name aloud in years. The sound filled the empty room, soft and sacred. That evening, as he walked out of the courthouse, a gentle breeze brushed against him. For once, the world didn't feel so heavy. He passed by the small park across the street, where children were playing and families were gathered. He stopped for a moment, watching them laugh, and smiled to himself. He realized something then. Justice isn't always about laws written on paper. Sometimes it's about people, about second chances, about remembering that every act of kindness, no matter how small, comes back one day in ways no one could ever expect. That night, he went home and finally finished his cup of tea. It was cold, but it didn't matter. He sat in his chair looking out at the fading sunset, and for the first time in many years he felt grateful. For life, for memory, and for the simple truth that kindness, once given, never truly dies. Weeks passed after that day in court, but the story of Daniel and his mother spread quietly through town. People spoke about it in coffee shops, at bus stops, and in the grocery store. Some called it a miracle. Others called it compassion. But for Judge Carter, it wasn't about either of those things. It was about a truth that had found him when he least expected it. He had returned to his usual work, hearing new cases and signing endless papers, but something inside him had changed. The courtroom no longer felt like just a place of judgment. It felt like a place where hearts met stories, where lives crossed paths for reasons that went beyond the law. One afternoon, a letter arrived at his office. The handwriting was uneven but familiar. He opened it carefully. "Dear Judge Carter, I wanted to thank you for giving me another chance. I've been working at the community center every day since my release. I help unload food trucks, clean up after meals, and sometimes I talk to people who are struggling like I was. I've met parents who can't feed their kids, people sleeping in cars, and old folks with no one left to visit them. Every time I hand someone a meal or carry a box of medicine, I remember what you said, that I could use my strength to help others. My mom is doing a little better. Her medicine is covered now, and the nurse who helped bring her to court still checks on her. She tells everyone that the judge was the kindest man she's ever met. Thank you for seeing me as a person, not just as a case file. I won't forget what you did. With respect, Daniel Morris." The judge read the letter twice, then folded it slowly. He placed it in the top drawer of his desk beside an old photograph of his wife. For a long while, he just sat there, the sounds of the courthouse fading into the background. Later that week, he decided to visit the community center himself. He didn't tell anyone he was coming. He wore a plain jacket and walked in quietly through the side door. Inside, the place buzzed with life, volunteers packing food, children playing, people chatting over warm meals. He spotted Daniel across the room, carrying a box of canned goods with 2 other volunteers. His face was brighter now, full of life and energy. When he turned and saw the judge standing there, his eyes widened in surprise. "Your Honor," Daniel said, setting the box down. "What are you doing here?" The judge smiled. "I came to see how you were doing. Looks like you're working hard." Daniel laughed softly. "Yes, sir. It feels good to be doing something that matters. I'm trying to help others the way people helped me." The judge nodded. "That's the best kind of justice, son. The kind that changes hearts, not just rules." At that moment, Mrs. Morris came out from a small office, moving slowly but smiling when she saw him. "Judge Carter," she said warmly. "You came all the way here?" "I did," he said, walking over to her. "I wanted to see how you were feeling." "I'm doing better," she replied, her voice steady. "The medicine's working and Daniel's been taking good care of me. You gave him back his hope. I don't think I could ever thank you enough." The judge shook his head. "You already did years ago. You just didn't know it." Her eyes softened with understanding, and for a brief second they both stood there remembering the past, the hospital room, the long nights, the kindness that had passed silently between them. Daniel watched them, not fully understanding the depth of what they shared, but feeling the warmth of it just the same. The judge stayed for a little while longer, talking with volunteers, helping carry boxes, even sharing lunch with the families there. No one treated him like a judge. For the first time in a long time, he felt simply human. not above anyone, not behind a desk, but part of the same world he had spent years judging from a distance. When he finally left, the sky outside was painted orange and pink. The air smelled of rain and a soft wind blew across the street. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, his heart light. He thought about all the cases he had handled over the years, all the people he had punished, all the laws he had enforced, and he realized that sometimes the truest form of justice wasn't in the punishment at all. It was in giving someone a chance to start again. As he reached the courthouse steps, he stopped and looked up at the tall building. He had always seen it as a place of order and power, but now it felt like something else, a place where humanity could still be found if one was willing to listen. He smiled quietly to himself and whispered, "Thank you, Anna." That night when he returned home, he placed Daniel's letter in a small frame beside his wife's photograph. He didn't need any medals or honors. That letter was enough, a reminder that compassion could turn pain into hope, and that one act of mercy could ripple farther than any law could reach. He sat by the window, the sound of rain tapping softly against the glass, and felt peace settle deep in his chest. For the first time in many years, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt full of memory, of gratitude, of life. Somewhere across town, Daniel sat beside his mother, reading to her while she rested. The world around them was still hard, still imperfect, but there was warmth now, the kind that only truth and forgiveness could bring. And though neither of them knew it, that same warmth glowed quietly in the judge's home too. Two lives connected forever by a simple act of understanding. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from a gavel or a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from the heart. And that was the truth that left the judge without words. A truth too powerful for speech, but strong enough to change everything. Months rolled by quietly, and life began to move forward for everyone. The world outside didn't stop. Cases came and went. New stories filled the courtroom, and people still lined up in search of justice. But inside Judge Carter, something had shifted forever. He no longer saw the courtroom as a place only for punishment. Every time someone stood before him, trembling and nervous, he looked deeper, beyond their mistakes, into the small stories hidden beneath. Sometimes he found anger, sometimes fear, and sometimes just ordinary people caught in hard circumstances. One morning, he sat at his desk, flipping through a new set of case files. Theft, assault, eviction, fraud. The words all felt heavy, but now he read them differently. He saw questions instead of crimes. What happened to this person? Who failed them? What can still be saved? His assistant knocked on the door and stepped in. "Sir, the first hearing is ready." He nodded. "I'll be there in a moment." As she turned to leave, she noticed the framed letter on his desk. "You still keep that one?" she asked, smiling. "Every day," he said quietly. "It reminds me what this job is really about." When he entered the courtroom, it was full as usual. People whispered, lawyers shuffled papers, the bailiff called for order. But the atmosphere felt different when he sat down, calmer, warmer, as if some invisible thread of kindness had woven itself into the air. That day, the case was about a young single mother who had failed to pay her rent and faced eviction. Her little girl clung to her side, frightened and silent. As the woman stood before him, tears streaming down her face, the judge saw not a rule breaker, but someone fighting the same silent battles Daniel once had. He listened carefully, spoke gently, and found a way to help her keep her home. It wasn't just about bending the rules, it was about using the space within them to bring fairness where it mattered. When the session ended, and the woman left crying with relief, the judge leaned back in his chair, feeling that same quiet satisfaction that had started the day he met Daniel and his mother. Later that afternoon, he received another letter. This one was shorter. "Dear Judge, Mom says hello. I got a new job at the warehouse. It's not much, but it's honest. I'm saving up for school again. Maybe someday I'll study law. Not to be a lawyer. I just want to understand how people end up where I was so I can help them before it's too late. Thank you again for believing in me. You changed my life." Daniel. The judge smiled softly. He folded the letter and placed it beside the first one. Then he took out a clean sheet of paper and began to write a reply. Dear Daniel, I'm proud of you. You remind me that second chances matter. Keep working hard and never forget the lessons you've learned, not from the law, but from compassion. One day you'll be the reason someone else finds their own hope again. Judge Carter. He sealed the letter himself and placed it in the outgoing mail tray. When he looked up, he noticed the late afternoon sun spilling through the window, painting the desk in gold. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, children played near the courthouse steps, their laughter echoing faintly. For a long moment, he just watched, breathing in the peace of it all. He thought about his wife again, about the long road from grief to understanding. He remembered the nurse who had once held his pain with quiet grace, and her son who had unknowingly returned that gift years later. Life had a strange way of circling, back connecting people through invisible threads of kindness. That night, as he left work, he stopped by the community center once more. It had become part of his routine now, not out of duty, but out of gratitude. He would drop by to see how things were going, to talk to the volunteers, and sometimes just to sit quietly and watch. When he arrived, Daniel was outside helping an elderly man unload boxes from a van. They didn't notice the judge at first. He stood a little distance away, just watching them. The way Daniel smiled, the patience in his movements, it reminded him of someone. Of himself, perhaps, at a time when he still believed the world could be kind. After a while, Daniel looked up and saw him. Judge Carter, he called out, grinning. The judge waved and walked closer. You're still here late? Daniel shrugged, laughing. We got extra donations today. I didn't want to leave until everything was sorted. Good, the judge said. That's how real change begins. One box, one meal, one small act at a time. Daniel nodded. You were right, sir. Helping others helped me too. It's strange, I used to think I had nothing. But now I feel like I've got everything that really matters. The judge smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. That's the best kind of wealth, son. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the street fading around them. Then the judge said softly, keep going. The world needs more people who understand mercy. When he turned to leave, Daniel called out after him. Thank you again, sir. For everything. The judge turned and nodded once. Thank your mother, he said. She taught both of us what real strength looks like. He walked away slowly, his steps calm and sure. The air was cool, the evening light fading into shades of blue. As he reached the corner of the street, he looked up at the sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, faint and scattered but full of promise. He smiled to himself, whispering under his breath, sometimes the truth doesn't need words. It just needs to be lived. And with that, he kept walking, the soft glow of streetlights guiding his way home. A quiet man carrying the truth that had once left him speechless, now turned into a life full of understanding and peace. Years passed and time gently carried everyone forward. The courthouse changed. New faces came, old ones retired, and fresh stories filled the air. But even as the seasons turned, people still remembered that one case and the day the judge chose mercy over punishment. Judge Carter had grown older now. His hair had turned completely white, and the lines on his face spoke of both wisdom and weariness. But his eyes still held that same quiet warmth that came from understanding life's deeper truths. He had stopped counting the years on the bench. What mattered to him now wasn't how many judgments he gave, but how many lives were changed for the better because of them. One cool autumn morning, he sat in his office with a cup of tea, looking out at the trees outside the courthouse. Their leaves were turning gold and red, drifting gently to the ground. A small smile crossed his face as he remembered his wife's love for autumn, how she used to collect fallen leaves and press them into her favorite book. A knock came at the door. Come in, he said softly. His assistant stepped inside, holding an envelope. This came for you, sir. It doesn't have a return address, but it looks personal. He took it, his curiosity piqued. The handwriting on the envelope was neat but unfamiliar. He opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter. Dear Judge Carter, you probably don't remember me. My name is Maria. Years ago, you helped my mother when she was about to lose our home. I was just a little girl then, but I never forgot your kindness. I'm grown up now. working as a nurse at the city hospital. Every day I try to help people the way you helped us. I wanted to say thank you, not just for saving our home, but for teaching me that kindness can live even inside a courtroom. You once told my mom that compassion and justice can exist together. I carry that lesson with me every day. The world is better because of you. With gratitude, Maria. The judge held the letter in his hands for a long time. He could feel his throat tighten as he read the words again. The paper trembled slightly between his fingers. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He remembered the case and the frightened woman and her daughter standing before him, tears on their faces. He hadn't thought about them in years. But now, seeing how that one decision had shaped another life, he realized how deeply the smallest choices could echo through time. He smiled to himself and whispered, "It's come full circle again." That evening, after his last hearing, he walked home instead of taking his car. The air was cool, and the streets glowed under the fading light. Every step felt slow but peaceful. When he reached the park across from his house, he stopped for a while and sat on a bench. He watched as children played, their laughter ringing out into the crisp air. A young man was helping an elderly woman walk slowly along the path. The judge's eyes followed them, and for a moment he thought of Daniel and his mother again. He wondered where they were now. Maybe Daniel had built a new life, maybe his mother was finally free from her pain. He didn't know, but he liked to believe they were happy. As he sat there, lost in thought, a familiar voice called out, "Judge Carter?" He turned and saw a man walking toward him, tall, smiling, carrying a small boy on his shoulders. It took a few seconds before recognition dawned. It was Daniel. "Daniel," the judge said, his eyes lighting up with surprise. "It's been years." Daniel laughed warmly and set his little boy down beside him. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me, sir." "How could I forget?" the judge replied, standing to shake his hand. "You and your mother left quite a mark on my life." Daniel's eyes softened. "She passed away last winter," he said quietly. "Peacefully in her sleep." The judge's expression turned gentle. "I'm sorry, son. She was a remarkable woman." "She was," Daniel said, smiling faintly. "Before she went, she made me promise to visit you one day. She said I had to thank you again and properly this time." "You already did long ago," the judge replied softly. Daniel shook his head. "No, sir. You gave me more than freedom. You gave me a path. After everything, I finished school. I now work at a legal aid office, helping people who can't afford lawyers. I guess I'm following in your footsteps in my own way." For a moment, the judge couldn't speak. His eyes glistened as he looked at Daniel, standing there with his little boy, a living symbol of everything he had once believed in. That's wonderful," the judge said finally, his voice low but full of emotion. "You did more than I ever expected," Daniel smiled. "You showed me what mercy looks like, sir. I just try to pass it on." The little boy tugged at Daniel's sleeve. "Dad, can I go play?" Daniel chuckled. "Go ahead, but stay where I can see you." As the boy ran off, the judge asked, "What's his name?" "Carter," Daniel said, smiling shyly. "We named him after you." The judge froze. For a moment, words completely escaped him. His eyes softened, his heart heavy with emotion he couldn't quite describe. "Thank you," he finally whispered. That's an honor I don't deserve." Daniel shook his head. "You do, sir. You gave me a chance when no one else would. My son deserves to grow up knowing what kindness looks like." They sat together for a while, watching the child play in the fading light. The world felt still, peaceful, almost sacred. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel stood and said, "We should get going." "It's getting late," the judge nodded. "Of course. I'm glad you stopped by, Daniel." "I'm glad too," Daniel said, smiling. "Take care of yourself, sir." "You too," the judge replied, his voice quiet. "And give little Carter my blessings." Daniel waved and walked away, his son's laughter echoing through the park. The judge stood there for a long time, watching them disappear into the distance. His heart was full of gratitude, peace, and something deeper than pride. When he finally turned to leave, he whispered to himself, "Anna, it all came back around. Every kindness, every choice, it all mattered." As he walked home beneath the soft glow of the streetlights, a smile lingered on his face. Sometimes he thought, life doesn't end with an answer, it ends with understanding. And that truth, the one that left the judge speechless all those years ago, still lived quietly in his heart, steady as ever. Proof that even one act of mercy could ripple through generations, turning pain into purpose and silence into peace.